Hi, my name is Jacob Card. I'm the curator over here at the Institute of Military Technology, and today we're going to briefly talk to you about some World War I American small arms. So starting off, we have the M1911. This was the preferred handgun of the US during World War I, and it's certainly one of the most historically significant handguns of all time. Most modern handguns use a variant of the Browning tilting barrel design, Glocks, CZ, SIG, so on and so forth. Something interesting about handguns in general in World War I is that the US issued very high numbers of them to its troops. Up to 60% of them actually were equipped with handguns throughout the war. But leading into the 1917, they had chronic shortages of the 1911, so they switched to revolvers for most of the troops. So these were produced by Colt and Smith & Wesson. Here we have the Smith & Wesson example. These were essentially adaptations of previously existing large bore models for 45 ACP, so that brought with it its own trials and tribulations, because 45 ACP is a rimless cartridge, so they had to adapt those with these kind of half-moon clips, otherwise they wouldn't eject properly. So around 2/3 of the handguns in Europe were actually M1917s. So going on to rifles, we have my personal favorite. This is the M1903 Springfield rifle, and this was the main service rifle going into the war in 1917. So something about the Springfield is that it's essentially a clone of the Mauser 98 system, so much so that the US actually had to pay copyright infringement payments to Germany. Of course, that stopped as the US entered the war in 1917, but it actually did resume from 1921 to 28. The Springfield is also a supremely accurate rifle. These are about 2 to 2.5 MOA usually, whereas most service rifles of the wartime years were about 4 to 5 MOA. So it's about twice as accurate as most comparable rifles, and the American riflemen were known to be particularly accurate with these guns. And that leads into the next gun we have. So next we have the 1903 Springfield with the M1913 Warner Swazey scope. One of the few areas where the US was actually proactive when it came to the European powers was the inclusion of telescoping sights on its rifles. So here we have the Warner Swazey 1913. It wasn't optimal, to be honest with you. Basically, if you got stuff inside the optic, which wasn't uncommon, it would actually magnify like the specks of dirt at 5 power. Also, I don't know if you can tell, but it has kind of these holes cut in the rubber eye cup, and that was basically so it didn't function as a giant suction cup as you shot it. I will say though that it was better than nothing. Certainly the US was proactive in its approach to snipers and marksmen during the wartime years, whereas a lot of European countries had to play catch up as they entered the war. So over here we actually have what was issued to most troops during the war. That's the M1917. So the thing with the Springfield is that there were about 200,000 of them that had been produced, and those were quickly exhausted as mobilization ramped up. The US had actually been making, the very private companies had been making pattern 1914 Enfields for the British at wartime production rates, so far in excess of what was being produced at Springfield. The US had 3 options. They could either wait for Springfield rifles, which wasn't really optimal, issue the pattern 1914 as is, which would have been the quickest option, or adapt the pattern 1914 for 30-06, which is what they ended up doing. That led us to the pattern 1917, or the M1917. It's actually a pretty good rifle. I think they both are about equal in terms of quality. I think they both have benefits and disadvantages compared to each other. The M1917 has much better sights. It's got an extra round, but it's a lot heavier. Not a lot heavier, but it is heavier and it's less wieldy. Personally, I prefer the Springfield because it's cock on open. That's more of a personal preference. But this is what most people would have been issued during the war. About 3/4 of troops will be using the M1917. So the next gun we're looking at is a uniquely American solution to the problems of trench warfare, and that is the Winchester M1897. So this is the first modern combat shotgun. One thing that differentiates the 1897 apart from a lot of other shotguns is its ability to slam fire, whereas you can keep the trigger held down, keep pumping it. The pump reaches the rear of the receiver, or the front of the receiver. It goes off, so you can really increase your fire rate that way. These have kind of a bit of a mixed reputation. They were very, very effective when they worked. The problem is that they issued out paper shot shells with these. They ended up instituting brass at the very end of the war, but entered the supply chains in significant quality. So the paper shot shells were very temperamental to moisture. So as they would get wet, they would actually expand and jam the gun. In terms of how they were actually used, they were very, I would say mediocre, but controversial. So now we have another very controversial gun. So that's the French Model 1915 Chauchat. So as the US entered the war, it did so without most of the modern small arms that would be essential to trench warfare, and machine guns were a big one. There were only about 500 machine guns of all types in US service as the US entered the war, which was totally insufficient. So a lot of times, most of the US machine guns were actually lended from their allies. In this case, the most significant automatic rifle of the war for the US was the Mle 1915 Chauchat, as issued by the French. So it's an 8mm label, so that's why you have this really curved magazine, because it's a rimmed cartridge. And speaking of, this is one of the biggest downsides of the Chauchat, is that it has this exposed magazine, as well as it's got this channel for the bolt. They weren't optimal. Besides those problems where dirt and stuff could get in and jam the gun. The bipod was very flimsy. They had a slow rate of fire and very violent recoil, and they also had a tendency to overheat. However, they weren't totally junk, and it was certainly better than nothing, and I can't really say the same about the next gun we're going over. The Mle 1915, certainly a very controversial gun. This one isn't, and not for good reason. So, this is the M1918 Chauchat, widely regarded to be one of the worst firearms of all time, not without good reason. So, it's essentially a 30-06 conversion of the Mle 1915, but basically, when they did the conversion, it's alleged that they did it improperly, and they just botched it, to be honest with you. So you have all the problems that the French one has, but everything's just even worse. It's super unreliable. It only has 16 rounds in the magazine, which is a really paltry sum, even by World War I standards. And I guess the only redeeming factor about this gun is that very few of them went to the front lines. So most people either had the French Chauchat or later the BAR. So that's the good thing about this gun, is that it wasn't used very often. So next up, we have an American design, mostly used by its allies. So here we have the Lewis gun. So this was very, very widely used by the Belgians and especially the British, and American troops who would be stationed by Belgian or British troops would sometimes be issued these. And an interesting thing about the Lewis gun is that its creator, Isaac Lewis, actually offered it, royalty-free to the US government. He was a true patriot. He actually had a feud with the head of the Ordnance Board, who was William Crozer. So it actually ended up not being adopted for US service, went overseas, saw a huge success with the British and the Belgians, and it was ultimately definitely one of the best light machine guns of the war. But it's definitely pretty heavy, so we're gonna get into something that has a little bit less capacity, but is much, much more man-portable. And that is the legendary M1918 BAR. This was basically a replacement for the Chauchat, and it was totally superior, much more reliable, much more ergonomic, better magazine capacity. It's just a fantastic firearm. Certainly it would be used more in World War II. They didn't really see much service during World War I. And another interesting fact about that is that the World War II version is actually, in my opinion, a downgrade over the World War I version. They swapped the sights on it. It has this great aperture on it currently, but they have kind of a leaf sight that's not great. They added a bipod and a carry handle at the very end of the war that add a bunch of extra weight. Kind of turned the BAR from an excellent automatic rifle into a very mediocre light machine gun. But generally speaking, anyone who was issued this, regardless of the conflict, loved it. It's definitely a very iconic American firearm. So lastly, we have something that isn't technically a firearm, but is something important, and you really have to talk about it if you talk about World War I small arms. That is the rifle grenade. These were an essential aspect of trench warfare and generally later warfare as well. They were very popular during World War II as well. Basically, the rifle grenade functions as an intermediary between the portability and lethality of hand grenades, but you can't throw them very far, as well as mortars. They don't have the lethality of either, but they're much more portable, and they have range that's kind of in between those two options. So they were a very important aspect about trench assaulting, also because you can do indirect fire, as well as just beyond visual, what you can shoot with a rifle. So what the Americans had in World War I was an adaptation of a French design, which they had for their, Lebels and Berthier rifles. And what's interesting about this is that it actually uses the bullet. I don't know if you guys can see the hole there, but there's one. It uses the force of the bullet and the pressure that it generates going through this little hole to launch the grenade forward. So that has some advantages and some disadvantages about it. The advantage is that you don't have to use special blank cartridges with it. You can just put the grenade in and shoot, whereas you're putting a live round through a high explosive thing. If it doesn't work properly, you have some issues there. We'll definitely say that. But overall, it was a very effective system. They would be changed upon, as technology progressed, leading into the M7 in World War II, but that's not for today. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I really did. And stay tuned for more content from us at IMT.